All right, welcome to part two of our first lesson. So now we're going to get into the study of the actual literature, and hopefully with this section of the first lecture, show you what it'll normally be like, going through that process of making some threads, reading the literature closely as we pull on those threads, and then coming up with some thesis statements, some assertions about what we've learned. Um, I will also have a short section in here on interpreting poetry. It's great to start with the Romantics because, as I just mentioned in the last part of the previous part of the lecture, that the Romantics were most known for their poetry. And in any survey class, you end up reading a lot of poetry because you have to cover so many authors. Um, in a survey class, that you need to read stuff that's short, and poetry is short. But poetry, I mean, every fiction drama, every form of literature has its own unique qualities and nuances that require different skills of interpretation. But poetry, more so than fiction or drama or any other genre, demands a specific approach. It's different than reading a novel, how you interpret it. So I also want to cover some background on how to read and interpret poetry. We're going to start with William Blake. These classes at Eastern actually used to be called Survey of British Literature to Blake and Survey of British Literature from Blake, because he is really like the first romanticist, and he marks this transition from the Enlightenment to the Romantic period. He has a lot of things about his writing that would fit in well with the Enlightenment, but his writing, it's so romantic, capital R romantic, as we'll see in a minute. And he's the earliest romantic in terms of when he was writing. So, in terms of the historical background, he and Wordsworth, who we'll also study here, lived a very long time, 70 years, and Wordsworth lived 80 years. And that's in contrast to Byron and Shelley and Keats, the darker Gothic romantics, were kind of the second generation romantics who lived these incredibly short lives. He studied at the Royal Academy of Arts. He took an apprenticeship to an engraver. So for Blake, the arts is almost as important as the poetry. He did this, what we call illuminated printing, which is something he invented and is very unique. Blake was not famous during his lifetime, unlike the other romantics, so he had to self-publish. And at the time, what you'd normally have is what you call typesetting, where the publisher would set the letters. But Blake, since he was self-publishing and also doing his art with his poetry, that's why I had one of those paintings on the last slide. He would write the text in reverse so that he could write it directly on the print and would draw the illustration right next to it. And they were on these copper plates. So you just get the poetry and the illustration right there on the engraving. And so this was incredibly time consuming. And so he didn't publish very many volumes of his poetry. And along these lines, to read a Blake poem without the pictures is to miss something important. He really did all these illustrations to go along with his poems. And so the pictures are very important to them, is what I'm saying. He did a short lyric poetry, which is what we see in Songs of Innocence and Experience, and we're mainly reading the short lyric poetry. There's so much reading for this first lesson that I didn't want to give you too much. So we're reading his short poems. And these are what he's most famous for. These are the poems most everyone knows. But he also wrote these long prophetic books. Blake essentially invented his own religion. Some people think of him as kind of crazy, and he was kind of crazy, as you've probably seen if you read the introduction to him in the anthology. But inventing your own religion is a very romantic type of thing to do. And so these are his longer prophetic books: The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, which is probably the most well-known one, The Four Zoas, Milton, and Jerusalem. We'll talk a bit more about the religion he invented in a minute. He was not famous during his lifetime. Wordsworth was really the first famous romantic writer. Blake, not so much. But he was revived in part by pre-Raphaelites. We'll learn about them later in the quarter during the Victorian period, because they were painters and they liked his paintings. But William Butler Yeats, you've probably heard of him, he's pretty well known in the 1920s, is really the one responsible for reviving Blake. And Blake is now widely read, widely studied. Most people know the short poems, but Blake's scholars, people with their PhD in Blake, have really studied the prophetic books, and they're very interesting too, if you ever have time to read them. So Blake is quite famous now and studied quite a bit now. But William Butler Yeats, who also invented his own religion, had a lot of similarities to Blake. Um, he was the one who in the 1920s said, "Hey, we should be reading, we should be studying William Blake," and people listened. So, as I said, Blake's prophecies and mythology are interesting, but his books of prophecy are long. So I didn't want to assign any of them for this class. But we should talk about what's contained in them because it's important to understanding Blake. And then as we go on to read and interpret the short poems, we'll see how they have similar themes to what Blake was doing in his mythology. So Blake had this very ambitious vision as a poet to articulate the full myth of humanity. He wanted to basically do his own version of the Bible or similar works. He wanted to give his own accounting of humanity's entire past, present, and future, which is what the Bible does, beginning with creation in Genesis and then Revelation, talking about the end of the world. Blake wanted to do the same kind of thing. So he used Christianity as a starting point for his mythology, and it has similar styles, similar stories, similar people. Some of the same ones actually from the Bible, but it deviates so much from Christianity. It's so different. If you're familiar with Christianity, you're probably not familiar with Blake's religion. It would be similar to, say, the Bible and the Quran, where they have similar stories, similar people, similar figures, but they are very different in terms of their worldview, their beliefs, etc. And so I'm going to go through now the key deviations of Blake from Christianity, since probably a good number of you are familiar with some basics of Christianity. I just think it's a useful way to help explain Blake. Especially as he uses it as kind of not his basis, but his starting point. So if you know the Bible at all, then you know that there's a narrative arc to the Bible, the way there is to any piece of literature, and that narrative arc is creation, fall, redemption. So Blake's mythology follows a similar narrative arc of creation, fall, redemption, but the way those three things, creation, fall, redemption, take place is different. So I'm going to go through how those three things in the biblical narrative arc, creation, fall, redemption, are different in Blake's mythology compared to the Bible's. So the world is not created by God, but by universal man. The fall is not the fall of humanity away from God. In other words, in Genesis 3, humanity's sins, they're then separated from God until Christ reconciles them to God. In Blake, it's a fall into division. So humanity is creator. Humanity then becomes disunified, and that's the fall in Blake. There's a similar in the Bible, the Tower of Babel. People become disunified as a punishment from God for their sin. But the main focus, main emphasis of the fall in the Bible is humanity's separation from God, not humanity's separation from each other, even though that is kind of like a side effect of the fall, you could say. For Blake, it's the main point of the fall. Finally, redemption does not come from Christ. For Blake, it comes from the human imagination and the prophetic poet. So I guess you could say Blake himself here is very important to humanity's redemption. So to me, this is really emblematic of Romanticism, because what it does is it takes the kind of core narrative from Christianity and makes the focus human beings rather than God, which is really what Romanticism does. It finds spirituality in nature and in humanity rather than in God, which is where before the Romantic period, traditionally Christians and most British people were Christians before the Romantic period. So it finds those things in nature and in humanity instead of in God. And so Blake's religion, even though he was kind of out there and not really recognized as a romantic at the time, it really is emblematic of Romanticism. It's basically to say it in a nutshell, it's taking the doctrines of the Bible and making them human-centric rather than God-centric would be a really easy way of kind of summing it up. So some other romantic themes we see in Blake's prophecies and mythology are a rebellious spirit. In his prophetic book, The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, he actually critiques the French Revolution, and so it's very engaged with the culture of the day. And then power of imagination and human-centric I already covered. Those are the romantic values that are part of Blake's prophecies and mythology. All right, so with all of that background in mind, let's do our first interpretation of literature as a class. What I'm going to do when I go over the literature in one of these presentations is model for you the approach I'll hope you'll use when you interpret the literature. So I'm going to identify some threads. I'm going to pull on those threads, and through close reading or analysis of the language in the literature, try to understand more what the literature is saying about those ideas, and eventually come to a conclusion, a thesis statement that explains the importance or the significance of that literature. So what's important to know about this is only one interpretation. This is my interpretation, and I am giving an interpretation that to a certain extent is recognized by scholars and critics as being kind of a standard interpretation of the literature. So you do need to learn my interpretation, and you will be quizzed on it for those reasons, but that's only 20% of your grade. And so I'm looking for this to mainly be a model of the methodology I'm hoping you'll use in your own interpretations. In your own interpretations, your creativity will be 80% of the grade. So I'm going to model for you here what I'm hoping you'll do, and I'm hoping you'll do much more through your work, basically. And then I'll learn about the literature from reading and grading your assignments, just as you're learning from me now. So I'm going to cover a lot of it, but not all of it. And along these lines, I should note that with the poetry, I'll often assign more poems than I'll cover in the lecture because they're short. And if we were meeting as a class, I would ask you which poems you'd want to talk about. And we might get to all of them, but we might not. And that gives you room then in your threads and thesis to talk about different things than me, or to talk about poems that I haven't even covered. Sometimes we'll cover them all. We won't always. With Blake, we certainly won't. I assigned a lot of Blake because they're short, interesting, easy to interpret. I think they're a lot of fun. Something to note about Blake, as well as William Butler Yeats, who we won't study, but who revived Blake since he wasn't famous during his lifetime, is they're both a little out there. They both have some really kind of different views that most people don't hold, but they have beautiful poetry that really makes some important statements about human nature. So one thing that really stood out to me when I was reading the introduction to Blake in the Northern Anthology was that he believed in two contrary views of the human soul. So what does that mean? How do we see it in his poetry? Basically, the human soul is doing two things at the same time, and those are in contradiction, paradoxical. So here's a thread. How does Blake's poetry represent two contrary states of the human soul? So I'm going to look at his poem, The Chimney Sweeper, the one from Songs of Innocence, and then try to figure this out as I look at it. Okay, so the close reading, which is looking at the language from the literature, is where we pull on the thread. I want to learn more about these two contrary states of the human soul. I'm going to look at a poem to try to do that. I'm now pulling on that thread. But as I said earlier, poetry is very different from fiction in terms of how to interpret it. And so I'm going to go through now how I would suggest you interpret poetry. It's difficult because it has figurative language, poetic devices. So it's almost like reading another language. I guess that's the easiest way to sum it up. Poetry is difficult to read, and you have to treat it differently than reading fiction or drama because it's like it's a foreign language. And so My suggestion then to interpret it is to translate it. So read the poem out loud very slowly one time through. Then paraphrase, or if you will, translate the poem line by line. So in the margin next to it, write what in your own words each line means. Read through your paraphrase and then reread the poem again. So reading poetry, it's short, you can do it quickly, you're not going to get much out of it. If I assign you 6 poems by Blake, for instance, and they're, really short and it can take you 10 minutes to read 6 poems, but I assign you a short story by Maria Edgeworth that takes you an hour to read, spend 2 hours on each. Read the whole Edgeworth story, but also spend an hour reading, 6 poems that would take you 10 minutes. Spend 10 minutes rather than 2 minutes on a poem. Using this, translating it in your own words, rereading it multiple times. Because if you just read it in the amount of time it takes you to just read it, you're not going to get as much out of it. So poetry is demanding in this way, but it's very rewarding. You can get so much out of it. It can be really fun, as I hope you'll see in the next few slides. So this statement encapsulates what I just said. Even though the poetry is shorter than the works of fiction and drama we'll read, spend just as much time on the poetry. Read the poems multiple times, try to interpret and paraphrase them in your own words. This is really the only way to get the meaning of the poetry. If you don't do this, you'll probably miss something. All right, so let's do this with Blake and see what we can figure out about these two contrary states of the human soul. So I'm not going to put each line on the screen, but I've done a paraphrase for each stanza. So what I would recommend here is pause the lecture real quick and open up your anthology to The Chimney Sweeper from Songs of Innocence. So the first stanza, the speaker's mother dies when he is very young. Because the speaker's father cannot or does not want to take care of him, he sells him into chimney sweeping. This was a common practice among the lower and working classes in 18th and 19th century Britain. The speaker's lack of commentary on his father's choice illustrates his naivete or innocence. So we can immediately see how the speaker fits in this Songs of Innocence collection by Blake, and we get the basic premise. He's sold into chimney sweeping. The point about his parents is important, especially when you compare it to the chimney sweeper from the Songs of Experience. That speaker knows his parents have sold him into chimney sweeping, and he is critiquing them for it. Whereas here, the speaker is naive. That's the difference between Songs of Innocence and of Experience. All right, so in the second stanza, the speaker's friend and fellow chimney sweep, Tom Dacre, is sad about having his head shaved as part of the chimney sweeping business. This is emblematic of the overall sorrowful life of a chimney sweep and exemplifies the poetic device synecdoche, where a part represents the whole. The speaker is not only naive, but also optimistic when he tries to cheer Tom up by saying the soot can no longer spoil his white hair. So what we have here is, as I mentioned, a poetic device called synecdoche, which is where a part of something stands for the whole. So Tom Dacre is sad about having his head shaved, and that specific instance of sorrow really represents how the chimney sweeping thing, it's awful, it's child labor, it's horrible. The child labor, as we'll see as we continue to study this time period, was quite prominent in Britain at this time. And so just the shaving of the hair here represents all of that sorrowful chimney sweeping child labor, and that's a poetic device we call synecdoche, substituting the part for the whole. But we continue to see the speaker's, the other thing we see here is the speaker's naive innocence, because he tries to turn a negative into a positive by saying, well, if you don't have hair, soot won't get in it. So that naive innocence carries on from the first. All right, stanza 3. The speaker believes he was able to effectively cheer Tom up because Tom stops crying and then has a dream that night. The dream begins with thousands of young boy chimney sweeps locked in coffins of black. So coffins of black foreshadow that the boys will probably die from chimney sweeping, but they also the chimneys are black and they're coffin-like. So you can see the chimneys are both figurative and literally coffins. And Tom stops crying after the chimney sweeper tries to cheer him up, the speaker does, and then has this vision, this dream, when he goes to sleep. In Tom's dream, in stanza 4, an angel with a key sets the boys free from their coffins or prisons or chimneys, whatever you want to call them. Then they play in a river under the sun. This is important because the river represents the washing away of soot, and they're no longer trapped in these coffins. They're in sunlight rather than darkness. So it's a very optimistic dream that continues on the optimistic view of things set by the speaker in the first stanza. The dream continues in stanza 5, where the boys then ascend up to the clouds with the angels. So we can probably infer that this is likely heaven. The angel tells Tom that if he is a good boy, he'll have God for his father and never want joy, which means he'll always have joy. He'll never be wanting of joy, which is what Blake means with that last line in this stanza. The part about God being their father is important because the chimney sweeps were either orphans or they'd been sold by their parents, so they were in effect orphans. And this last line, the angel tells Tom that if he's a good boy, he'll have God for his father, never want joy. That's really important, how it connects with the last line and the last stanza, the last line of the poem. Which is what we're going to look at now. So in the final stanza, Tom's dream ends as the boys wake up and go to work. Though the working conditions are harsh, this is synecdoche again. It's cold, so that's talking about how the conditions are bad in general. Tom is happy and warm because of his dream, and this dream came from the speaker, right? The speaker tries to cheer him up, then he has this beautiful dream. So what does this all mean? The final line says, so if all do their duty, they need not fear harm. It's connected to the last line of the previous stanza. If you're good, you'll never want joy. So Blake's using another poetic device here, irony. And so the speaker and Tom are very optimistic. But in reality, they'll probably die. And any reader of the poem who knows anything about chimney sweeping at this time knows they'll probably die. And the coffins of black alludes to that. And so there's this irony where the characters, the speaker in the poem, are being optimistic and not facing reality, but the reader knows the reality. And so that makes it very effective poetry. Rather than just saying chimney sweeping is bad, Blake uses this irony to really drive home to the reader how bad it is. And so his purpose is to show how bad chimney sweeping is, and by using irony, he does that in a very emotional way, which is very effective. We get caught up in the story of the chimney sweeper and Tom, and we hope they'd be saved, like they believe they will be, but we know they won't. And so it's incredibly sad, and that's going to move us more toward maybe wanting to help them than, say, just reading about the harsh realities of chimney sweeping in a report might move us. So this really illustrates the power of poetry through these poetic devices of synecdoche and irony. Excuse me. So what did we learn from this? Well, what I just said, that his purpose is to convey the harsh realities of child labor, and that he uses synecdoche and irony to do this. But in reading this, two really important questions come up to me. So I had this thread about the two contrary natures of the human soul, and then I had a deeper reading of it. Now, what have I learned? Well, my thread about two contrary natures has pushed me to even bigger questions, that if I answer these questions, they could be my thesis. So which is better, innocence or experience? Those are the two contrary natures of the human soul. You get both as you read it. The speaker is innocent, but the reader is experienced. Those are the two contrary natures. So my question I now have is, which is better? The boy's innocence helps the other boys and him in the immediate and protects them from knowing the harsh reality that they will most likely eventually die doing this work. So is this kind of immediate protection a good thing? Is that their only respite from this evil of child labor? And even though they'll eventually die, is it worthwhile to have that in the moment and not acknowledge reality? Or is it better to just know the truth? Is ignorance bliss, I guess? Is innocence bliss, you could say, is my question. And I say research question here is that I've moved on from my question that was my thread, but now I have something I can really explore to try to come up with a thesis if I want to write a paper on this. I also ask, is the poem Christian or anti-Christian? Christians believe that God is their father, which for Christians is meant to be a great comfort as they navigate the harsh realities of a fallen world. We live in a fallen world, a world where there's child labor. There's no question that this world is fallen. The question is what do we believe about its fallenness? And so Christians believe there's something better waiting for them in heaven because God's their father. But does Blake agree with this? Or when he says that, when the angel says that God is their father to the chimney sweeps, is he promoting a Christian view to give them hope, or is he actually critiquing Christianity? So this is another question that came out of my deeper reading by pulling on the thread that I could then explore in more detail, continue to read to try to figure out, research Blake to try to figure out, and eventually take a stance on it in the paper. One really important thing I want to note here is that in my class, any interpretation, if it's supported by close reading and you prove it through your reading of the poem, is valid. I'm not going to reject one of your ideas based on the idea itself. I'll only reject it based on whether or not you have the evidence to back it up. So what I'm going to do here is answer my question and provide two sample thesis statements. They're going to be completely contradictory. Now, I firmly believe that through close analysis of Blake's poem, you can effectively support either of these thesis statements, even though they completely disagree. And so if you were hypothetically to use one of these as a thesis for your paper, you can't. You have to come up with your own. But I'm just saying hypothetically, if you did and you analyzed the poem really well and your analysis was clearly connected to your thesis, either of these thesis statements would be an A if you backed it up with your analysis of the poem. They would not be not an A based on the idea itself. So I'm going to show you how. This is one of the great things about literature. This is why I love to study it. But one of the great things about literature is you can have two completely contradictory views of the same work of literature and both be supported. And that's another what I think is defining characteristic of great or canonical literature is when you can have two contradictory views that are both essentially true about the poem, a piece of literature. So the first one, Blake uses the Christian concept of God the Father to give comfort to the child laborers in his poem, The Chimney Sweeper, when an angel shows the boys that despite their imminent death in the chimney sweeping business, they will one day be in heaven. So this is a reading of the poem that is, I guess you could say, a Christian reading that says what Blake is saying with this vision is that it's true, the boys will die, and that's sad, but they'll be in heaven one day, and that should give them and the reader hope. Here's the second one. Blake attacks what he believes to be the false hope of Christianity in his poem, The Chimney Sweeper, when he juxtaposes a vision of heaven with the harsh realities of working in chimneys or black coffins of death. So this is the anti-Christian one, you could say, and is critiquing, what Blake sees as the false hope of Christianity, that this vision Tom has won't actually save him. He's still going to die. There's no way out of his dying. And we need to focus on that reality. So two very different theses. Again, I think the language of the poem supports both. And so either works. And I just wanted to give you, one, a couple good examples of thesis statements, and two, show how open I am to your arguments. The main thing is you have to support them with close reading. And I believe all the close reading I did on the 3 slides that precede this one supports, both of these statements. So that's an overview of how to go through the process, how to come up with a thread, how to look at the literature more closely, pulling on that thread, and then how to come up with a claim about what the literature means. I've gone from wondering about two contrary states of the human soul to having a thesis about Blake's view of Christianity. So hopefully that illustrates the process for you. Hopefully you can apply it um, in your own reading. And so now you can go and do the same thing with this poem. You can come up with your own interpretation, or you can do it with any of the other Blake poems I've assigned for your discussion board post. Before we wrap up this part of the lecture, I'd like to go over two other poets who I also assigned. I think just one or two poems from each, um, to because they're very important romantic writers, and you need to know about them before we move on. So the first is William Wordsworth. He was the poet laureate, and I guess you could say the most famous romantic poet. And personally, I find him the least interesting of the romantics. I love the romantics. I think they're fascinating, but I just have a hard time getting into Wordsworth. I can see why he's important and significant, and I'm going to explain that on this slide so that you know that and you know him. But we're just not going to spend much time on him because I don't think he's as interesting as the other ones, to put it simply. So Wordsworth grew up near the Lake District in England, and as a boy, spent time taking the natural sights and sounds, that's a typo, sorry, of the countryside, as well as getting to know the local cottagers, shepherds, and solitary wanderers. So his poems are really, the reason Wordsworth is so important is his poems are really emblematic of this time and the nature, the working class, those images that one associates with the more hopeful side of romanticism, those are found all throughout Wordsworth's poems. So in that sense, he's really the quintessential romanticist, or romantic, excuse me. And he saw these things growing up. He grew in this rural part and saw nature. Some important things about him. He went to college at Oxford, but during his junior year, he visited France in 1790, and then after he graduated in 1791, he went back for an entire year from mid 91 after he graduated through 92. He became a supporter of the French Revolution, so he was in Paris a year after the fall of the Bastille, and so that revolutionary spirit, he really soaked that up. Another reason he's a quintessential romantic. He fell in love with a woman named Annette Vallon, and they had a child named Caroline. They were planning to marry, but he was forced to return home to England because he ran out of money. He didn't have a great inheritance till later on. And then the war changed. If you know much about the French Revolution, I believe the introduction to Romanticism in our textbook covers this. But if you know much about Romanticism, then you know that or if you know much about the French Revolution, you know that after kind of the revolutionary phase in the 1790s, Napoleon seized power. Napoleon used the revolution to seize power of France, and it changed from a revolution to Napoleon's quest for world domination, which had included a war with Britain. And so once Napoleon took over, the French Revolution no longer represented to Wordsworth what he believed was great about it, this rebellion against authority. It actually represented the reverse, Napoleon trying to take over the world. And one of his steps in trying to take over the world was war with England. And they were in war with England until 1815, a long, long time. And so Wordsworth had to leave France, and he was never able to marry Annette or be with Caroline. He eventually, when he came into an inheritance years later, never reconciled with Annette, was never with her, but gave her a large sum of money, and they ended on, I believe, friendly terms. After he returned to England from these experiences, that's when his poetic career really began. And he became friends and neighbors with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who we'll read in lesson 2, and together they composed a collection of poems called lyrical ballads. And lyrical ballads encapsulates a lot of those romantic things, the imagination, the working class, as I mentioned above, and is considered by many, since Blake wasn't famous during his lifetime, this is about 4 years after Songs of Innocence and Experience, they published Lyrical Ballads. Lyrical Ballads is really considered like the start of Romantic literature because the poems by Wordsworth and Coleridge in that collection are so emblematic of Romanticism. Furthermore, in Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads, that preface is considered an important statement of critical theory. So if you take the critical methodologies class, you'll actually study Wordsworth's preface to Lyrical Ballads. And in it, he argues for a theory of primitivism, which is where he argues that poets should take as their subject matter ordinary things, such as nature in the lower and working classes. So in this sense, Wordsworth, through his own prose writing, really formulates kind of, you could say, the theory that underpins Romanticism. He basically says Romantics should be doing what most of them ended up doing before most of them did it. And so in that sense, you can start to see why people consider Wordsworth so important. I just don't find him as interesting as the others in terms of his actual writing of poems. He was named Poet Laureate in 1843. And the Poet Laureate is considered the national poet of Britain. So it was a hugely significant honor for him. And some examples of his poetry, lines composed above Tintern Abbey, which is the last poem in Lyrical Ballads. And then also his lifelong autobiographical work, which is a long narrative poem called The Prelude. They both really exemplify what he did and what made him famous, which is these long, self-reflective spiritual meditations on the growth of his own mind. And the growth of his own mind parallels his relationship with nature in these poems. So it's really similar to what we see in I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud, which is the one poem by him that I asked you to read. What we see happen in a short space there where he has this experience with nature, and then we see kind of his development where now he can then look to this experience with nature anytime he's feeling lonely. That connection between his own psychology and his experience in nature. His most famous poems are much longer and do that in a much longer form. And so that's Wordsworth in a nutshell. Dude thinks he's a cloud. That's my summary of Wordsworth and of Romanticism. But seeing that on a larger scale in a longer poem, that's what made him famous, and it really is emblematic of Romanticism. So that's why Wordsworth is important, and I think that's what you need to know about him going forward. We're going to look at one last poet before we wrap up this part of the lecture, and that's Robert Burns, who, again, is really important, but we only have so much time in this class. So we're going to quickly look at his background and do a quick, close reading of one of his poems. He was called a heaven-taught plowman, and he's an example of what we call a peasant poet. We'll look in more detail in lesson 3 on another peasant poet named John Clare. But these are basically ordinary poets from the working class, is the idea here. And that was an important part of the Romantic movement was, the elevation of the working class to the subject of poetry. But the members of the working class went from beyond just being subjects of poems to being composers of poems. And they were called peasant poets. And the two examples we have are Robert Burns and John Clare. But the key thing about Burns is he was Scottish, and he's like the national poet of Scotland. So that's another reason why he's important, and we're going to briefly look at him here. He was widely read and self-educated. So he worked on his father's farm growing up. He was a peasant, essentially, but he read so much. And his father did make enough money to get him some schooling, not much, but some, which is different from the other peasant poet. We'll look at John Clare later on, who had no formal schooling. And so Burns was very knowledgeable of poetry and poetic theory, but it mostly came from his own reading. In his poetry, he relied on an oral tradition of folklore and popular balladry. And so a lot of the poets at the time, even Wordsworth, would take oral folklore or oral ballads from the time from among, the working and lower class and adapt into their poetry. And Burns did the same thing in Scotland. He just was kind of part of that class of society himself. His poems were initially popular, very popular, both to the working class society he came from, as well as the upper class who really liked to read poetry. He wasn't as popular later in his life as the introduction of the textbook talks about, but initially his poems were very popular. So his subject matter, nature, animals, the working class, it really anticipates Wordsworth and his theory of primitivism. Burns was writing a little bit before Wordsworth. Um, and he uses Scottish dialect, which was, if you read the poems, they were probably hard to read because they're written in this Scottish dialect. And that was something Wordsworth wanted, he called for in his preface to Lyrical Ballads, that he called for poets to do, was to use the language of the working class and to not just use this hoity-toity language. So Burns does exactly what Wordsworth called for people to do, but a little bit before Wordsworth actually asked people to do it. And this dialect is really important. It's part of what makes him the national poet of Scotland. He, this is for all time. He wasn't just a poet laureate like Wordsworth. Wordsworth was quickly succeeded by Tennyson. But if you go to Scotland today and go into restaurants, there's pictures of Robert Burns, everywhere you go. So he was like the national poet of Scotland because he wrote in the Scottish dialect that was unique to Scotland, but he was popular and successful enough that he was world renowned and from Scotland. So they love him there today, which is great. So a real quick, close reading of his poem "To a Mouse," which in my estimate is an early example of environmental literature. If you've studied critical theory in any of your classes or taken some of the classes on environmental literature that EW offers, you'll know that there's a recent good trend in literary studies to look at how poetry, fiction, whatever literature you're looking at, argues for a more conscious attitude toward the environment. And we see this in the poem. When the speaker regrets accidentally destroying the mouse's home with his plow, he even sees the mouse as a fellow mortal. And finally, there's this reputation of mice as they're dirty, they're gross, carry diseases. He kind of debunks that or explains the rationale behind the mouse. In lines 13 to 18, the entire third stanza, he goes through how the mouse needs to basically steal food and crumbs to survive. That the things mice do that are gross to us are their means of survival. So there's this is an environmental literature because there's an instance of the speaker here identifying what the mouse needs to do to survive and acknowledging that as important, that the mouse is a fellow creature. So this is just one example of how Burns's poetry encapsulates that ordinary, everyday, kind of mundane subject matter, and doing that was, a key part of Romanticism.